I think I'm going to make everybody do some jumping jacks just to get everybody excited. I promise you I'm the last one. There's a break right after me. So I'll try to slam through this as quickly as I can. So Fifth Wall, we're kind of like the baby company here. We're about a year old. We're kind of like an agency, kind of like a consultancy, kind of like a studio. What we essentially do is connect the dots for businesses, especially when it comes to the existing technologies today in AR and VR. So in some ways, we've seen some amazing companies here that are talking about the near future, some of them talking about a little bit further future. We're like the nearer future, like today. And at Fifth Wall, we're obsessed with the number 12. And this is a metric that represents the average attention span of everybody in this room today. Okay? You want to take it's probably less than that right now. You want to take a guess what it is for millennials? Close. Jesus, 2. 7 seconds. 7 seconds. It's still very scary because you just skip one generation and you're talking about a 50% shorter attention span. And it's even scarier when you look at in the next few years, the millennial generation is actually going to represent 36% of the adult population and close to 50% of the workforce. And so when I saw a study that talked about that people that tried VR for the first time left to their own devices, their average time spent was about 13 minutes, I said I have to explore this new realm. And I didn't know much about AR and VR. In fact, I thought that AR was a glorified QR code. When I thought about VR, I thought it was like this stuff, right? But the reality is a little bit different. And as you're seeing today, and as we're going to keep talking about through the afternoon, there's no doubt in my mind, and anybody in the industry, that VR and AR will be the next tech platform to change the world. And if you don't believe me, this picture here was about a year ago at the Facebook F8 conference. You could see Mark Zuckerberg talking about the 10-year strategy for Facebook. And this partly explains why they purchased the company, Oculus, for $3 billion before they even had a product in market. Now, last week, they tried to solve a bit what Ted was talking about today, the box-on-face syndrome, by announcing their kind of Ray-Ban moment, how to transform the box-on-face into a pair of eyeglasses that we'll all wear. And maybe even more scary for some people in the room, he talked about dismissively the future of television by basically saying that we won't even need TVs, that you can just download a $1 app and place the TV wherever you want, which is either good or bad. And then he announced all sorts of other things like Facebook Spaces, which are these 360 spaces that you can hang out with your friends. And obviously, from a work perspective, collaboration, this is going to be a version of that is what we're going to use on the work front. And then a pretty bold Facebook engineer said that in 5 years, everything that we were talking about earlier in terms of transforming your smartphone, your robot, into a pair of glasses will actually occur in 5. I don't think 5 is accurate, but I don't think, that far off. And then you have other guys, Microsoft HoloLens. In fact, one of our most interesting projects, one of the first projects we worked on, was with a company in Italy that manufactures leather shoes. And we worked with them on an algorithm that would essentially take cowhides and create holographic lines to optimize the cuts they were using when they were sort of lasering the cowhides. Google, we talked about Google earlier. Obviously, Google doing quite a bit in space. And then obviously there's the intangible here of Apple. And Apple has been doing something that's quite uncharacteristic for Apple. They're actually talking about future products. Tim Cook said that augmented reality is going to be a fundamental part of Apple's future. And the numbers all support this. You guys have seen charts like this, the faster adoption rate of new technologies. VR is already on a very similar trend. And even though the numbers are not quite at the level that you see for smartphones or internet usage, it's still quite impressive at this relatively early stage in the marketplace. And anybody who's anybody will look at the future and basically say you have a big, giant market that's about to wake up. And just to give you perspective, does anybody want to guess what the box office domestically was last year? Hollywood, all movies. Domestic, 11 billion. Domestic. Worldwide was about 38. Compared to these numbers here, pretty impressive. Now, what really is fascinating for me is the fact that You know, for the first time in a long time, the interest level in this technology, whether you were talking about a Generation X or a baby boomer, is actually relatively the same. And this bodes very, very well for adoption rates. But if you look at the market, click, there you go. It's still a bit of a shambles. And this kind of reminds me of the early days of the internet. You guys remember Excite and Lycos and Alta Vista? It's kind of what's happening right now. And if you look at just distribution outlets, I mean, there's quite a few things that have to be figured out. So what's the good? The good is we're still in very early days. You could actually compare it and say it's kind of like 2007. I actually prefer to say it's like 1995. And 2007 is reference to where we were at the beginning of smartphones. The bad is that the content, it's kind of a mixed bag. You have some really, really good stuff out there, and you have some stuff that's actually not that great. And that's creating this sort of this disappointment gap in users where they're kind of, you know, they try VR and they're like, yeah, it's kind of okay, but not quite there. And then the ugly is there's missing the killer app, right? There really isn't the Instagram, the Snapchat, the Uber app that forces everybody to use the technology every single day. But that could change. And it could change actually very quickly. If you think about the fact that in the last quarter, Apple sold a record amount of iPhones. It sold about 78 million iPhones, which they did with a relatively kind of mediocre update with, let's say, the iPhone 7. If Apple even delivers 50% of what we're hearing about in the iPhone 8, is the idea of selling 100 million units in a quarter crazy? No. So what happens? Almost overnight, your AR distribution problem gets solved. So our thinking is this. Today, the use cases for VR and AR are very industry-specific. B2B probably having the most compelling use cases. But by tomorrow, all industries are going to be transformed. In fact, how we work and how we use VR and AR, I'm not talking just about how we consume it. I'm talking about how we understand information and how we have perspective is going to undergo a pretty fundamental shift. So what I'm going to do today is I'm actually going to show you in the nearer future, today, some use cases across 4 industries of how VR and AR is sort of transforming the space. And I'll start with retail. This is something that the CEO of Tommy Hilfiger said a few years ago. It's not about sales per square foot, it's about surprises per square foot. And he was referring to the fact that stores have to change the shopping experience into an experience. And that's in line with how millennials actually consume and buy. And so what did Tommy Hilfiger do? They did a VR app where they showed future lines. And then guys like Dior followed suit to build affinity with their users. They actually built these little VR centers inside their stores where you could actually be on the Paris fashion show, and they did it for like 2 or 3 seasons. And we've all heard about, you know, virtual shopping, where one day you're going to be able to go to the Burberry flagship store in London and buy a suit if you need to. But where it gets really interesting for me is if you understand a little bit about the fashion industry, you know that inventory is their enemy, right? And so what's happening today with fast fashion? Buy stuff, it goes out of style very quickly. So there's nothing worse than being stuck with inventory. And we actually had a client come to us and say, can you help us build a virtual closet? The original idea was, why don't we take all of the buyer behavior data that we have on what your users are buying and create a virtual closet today with what you have in the store inside a VR experience. But then we thought about it differently. We said, what if you actually use this opportunity to determine future SKUs and styles? You could actually have a display of samples that you haven't actually produced, and you can see if people are going to buy or not, to actually save you millions of dollars down the road in terms of inventory. And the use case is just as compelling on the AR side. So L'Oreal already has an app where you could actually, sort of using the same technology as Snapchat, you could try different makeup on your face. Actually, lots of fun. I tried it once with my son. He was laughing his head off. And yesterday, a gentleman told me that in wine stores, when you put, you know those shelf markers to kind of identify a particular wine? When you have one of those on, it actually increases sales by 50%. So imagine going to a store and increasing the shelf space, whether it's olive oils or, you know, a $600 Canada Goose jacket versus a $1,000. You're trying to figure out, why am I buying one versus the other? This is an incredibly powerful tool to do so. And it applies across everything. You know, this was an example we did for Warby Parker, where we're looking at how to use your iPad to go through a virtual store. And for the marketing people, we were trying to solve something. Marketing people want information on their users. They want to understand who's buying stuff. And you guys have all had those warranty cards. How many people actually fill them out? Ever? Exactly. So imagine you just take your phone, you look at the warranty card, it identifies, call it the target image, the AR target image, connects with your Facebook Connect, and you're done. It takes 3 seconds. Where it gets compelling for me is actually it increases the product knowledge of the sales staff. Now, one thing I hate more than anything is going to a store and knowing more than the person that's selling to me. And if you look at AR as a training tool to try to figure out what is the actual value add when you go into a store, that's where it starts to get incredibly interesting. And this applies, again, across the board, whether you're selling glasses or shoes or something very unsexy like a mattress. Healthcare, same thing. We've all heard stories about how the medical space is going to change with VR. There's this great story of how a doctor saved a 6-month-old baby with a Google Cardboard. But this has been going on for a while. I mean, VR has been used to help rehabilitate people with brain damage, with pain management, with PTSD, and actually used during surgeries. We had an interesting client come to us very recently who's involved in doing sort of remote medical services. And they wanted to put a 360 camera real-time inside an ambulance. So if you were in a remote location and a doctor couldn't get to it, you could actually connect live with a doctor who could help do a real-time diagnosis as either the ambulance is getting to the hospital or a helicopter is arriving in a remote location. And so this allows a doctor to kind of go in there and have his own perspective and his own preliminary diagnosis and actually give emergency instructions to the people on the ground. In the entertainment space, last year we had a chance to shoot the 50 Shades Darker VR, and it was really interesting because we took for granted that both actors and crew knew how to handle a VR camera. And a VR camera, if you've ever seen the Ozo, it kind of looks like this little alien being. It's a very interesting camera. And the actors, even though they were pros, didn't know how to quite react with the camera because in the VR space, or in the 360 space, you actually can't cheat. Everything is exposed. And even the crew, they're used to placing cameras in the right locations, but when you're creating an immersive environment, actually angle and where the camera's position is actually very, very important. But what was more interesting for Universal was when we presented the analytics to show them, were we shooting the right thing? And this is something that's going to fundamentally change because you're trying to have some sort of effect, and how do you know if it's real? Now with VR and heat mapping and eye tracking and all of that good stuff, this is going to become a reality. We also do a lot of set tour production things, and this is helping directors in terms of how they set up scenes. In fact, we mentioned it a bit earlier. If you look at the latest Star Wars movie, the director actually used virtual reality to do these storyboards where he was trying to draw out how you want to do certain CG shots. But if you think about it, even for auxiliary products, imagine you did the Batman Lego scene and you gave it to kids to see which toys they were interested in. You could actually produce the toys that they were looking at, and the ones that they weren't interested, you essentially just scrap. We also worked on the first ever zero gravity experience with Tom Cruise, The Mummy. And we worked with the good folks at Positron with those beautiful chairs right there. And we were talking about this yesterday. We said, when we had to transfer files back and forth, it was a goddamn nightmare because we had to actually deliver this for South by Southwest where it was going to be premiered. And it got us into all sorts of conversations related to collaboration. And one of the most important ones was, how do we actually use, whether it's VR and the chairs together, to change whether the way that athletes train. For example, we're doing something where we're shooting an Olympic athlete going down a ski slope. And of course, you can use this for physical training, but think about the mental training you could do by combining both VR with, let's say, a positron chair where he gets to actually experience the feeling of going downhill. Same thing for an F1 driver and all sorts of other sports. In fact, it's being used right now in the NFL and certain college teams, especially for quarterback training. And here you get into the obvious use case, right? This is probably where you're going to have the highest ROI. Everybody knows this, that there's no reason in the next, call it 10 years, for you to ever buy a house or a condo without actually walking through it, even if it doesn't exist, and being able to customize it. But this is actually going to impact everybody along that sort of food chain. So whether you're talking to architects who need to understand how they're designing in space and how virtual reality can help them, to the guy that's actually the project manager who has to decide where, let's say, the HVAC systems go so that somebody's not placing something in the wrong place. Everything is going to transform. And here, AR is also going to have a very prominent place. Now, this actually is not realistic, right? Because you can't actually make stuff pop out of your phone yet. But when you talk about AR glasses, this becomes very realistic. In fact, if you take out the phone, this is actually what's going to happen today. We actually did a project similar to this already, and we're actually talking to sports franchises in Europe who are developing new stadiums. And what they want to do is, show the fans the new stadiums where the new home of their new favorite team is going to be, to keep them engaged and at the same time sell more corporate boxes. So if you see where you're going to be, you're more likely to obviously pay. And so all of a sudden, the most boring marketing material, brochures or otherwise, become interactive. You have a target image, clicks, start customizing, et cetera, et cetera. And think about it in terms of maintenance. I could actually go today and with an iPad or an iPhone, look around this building if I had the proper CAD files and look at what's behind the walls. And this is going to extend to all of the auxiliary industries to real estate. This is actually an example of one of the largest window manufacturers in North America that we're working on. And if you guys have ever replaced windows in your home, you know it's a very expensive endeavor. It could cost you anywhere between $20,000 to $200,000. So why wouldn't you want to customize and get a sense of what these windows will look like before you spend that kind of money? And that's what we're sort of going to do. Now, I think I'm out of time or not, so we're going to run a demo. I guess we are running the demo. Okay, perfect. Patrick is here. Patrick, say hello.
Hi.
Perfect. And so this was actually our first ever project at Fifth Wall. This was a project we did in the city of Montreal in the north. They were building this new downtown. And right now, if you go to it, it's a relatively vacant lot. And so we did both an AR project where we made the entire city block pop up to get the citizens and the mayor sort of on board. And then we created this virtual walkthrough so that potential restaurants, hotels, office lessees could actually see what the building would look like, what the environment was going to look like, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is just Patrick kind of going through it. We actually have this experience there on the booth alongside The Mummy and 50 Shades, and you guys can try it. And one thing I would absolutely recommend is you trying to walk off the ledge. Everybody loves doing that, and it's fascinating to actually see people think they're going to fall. In this case, I would. But and then the other thing we're going to show you is also a very early project we worked on for CBRE, where if you look at this, and I was talking about the fact that you have a target image, a regular piece of paper. This is a map of Manhattan. You could actually turn this into an interactive experience. It's going to go up there on the wall. There we go. So if you looked at it, the target image got activated. And in this case, they wanted to show all of the listings that they had in Manhattan, and you could kind of go in and get more information. If you've ever gone through the experience of looking for office space, this is incredibly helpful. So with that, you guys are done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo Poupada. Big round of applause, and I really appreciate it.